All right, go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. Can you guys see that? Just go ahead and indicate in the chat whether or not you can see my slides, because I don't want to lecture assuming that you guys can. Okay. Great. So just some announcements for class. So we do have a reading quiz that is due at 11:59 p.m. tonight. That reading quiz is technically open book, but as you guys know, my reading quizzes are pretty straightforward. So if you need to use the book, that's fine, but I don't think that it's necessary. As long as you've done the reading, it's pretty straightforward. So again, please make sure you do that by 11:59 p.m. tonight. It's still worth 5 points. And then also, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you do the discussion posts. There are 2 that are due by this Wednesday, and I know that's off of our Tuesday, Thursday schedule. What I'll actually do right now is exit out of, wait, hold on, where it says stop share, share another screen with you guys so that you can see what specifically I'm referring to. So just bear with me really quickly. All right, so if you go to modules here on Canvas, and let me know if you can't see the screen. Go to modules, and I know on you guys' end it looks different. Not modules, I'm sorry, discussions. And then, like I said, there are 2 discussion posts to complete. The first one is worth 10 points. As a reminder, I've lowered the stake on some of the major assignments, your feature article, and then your writing portfolio. And just to kind of redistribute those points, I've created like smaller or lower stake assignments that are really, really easy. The first one is just a check-in. I just want to see how you guys are doing. And then more importantly, how can professors help you guys out in this transition? And then in that particular discussion post, make sure that you respond to just one other classmate's post as well to get the full 10 points. And then I sent out a video, I believe it was last Friday, that really details everything in terms of like the changes that have taken place to our course. Make sure if you haven't already done so, go ahead and listen to that video. And then once you're done, respond to this discussion post as well. That's worth 5 points. All right. Go back here. And then also in terms of assignments that are coming up, we have the 4th AP style homework that's due this Thursday. That is also open book. I will say if for whatever reason you don't have the access to the AP style book anymore, please make sure you reach out to me. I'll try to give that to you in some capacity. And then we have our AP style quiz that's next Thursday. Just like how it was when we were meeting face-to-face, the homeworks are typically due a week before the quiz takes place. And again, as a reminder, the AP style quizzes are open book as well. And then I'm going to kind of give you guys a heads up. We do have a tight deadline assignment that's due on not next Tuesday. Yes, next Tuesday, excuse me. And that's already been posted. I'm going to go through that in more detail on Thursday, but I didn't want to overwhelm you guys with too much information during today's class. But again, just to give you guys a heads up, because I noticed I forgot to put that there. So homework due this Thursday, a tight deadline assignment due next Tuesday, and then the AP style quiz due next Thursday. But everything that I've mentioned so far is due at 11:59 p.m. on that specific date. It's no longer, at the beginning of class, because I understand that some of us are not just in Columbus, you guys are outside of the state, some of us are outside of the country even. So I wanted to give you guys that flexibility. And like I said in my email announcement, if you're feeling overwhelmed, please reach out to me. I'm definitely trying to be a lot more accommodating and flexible given what everyone is going through. But if you don't reach out to me, if I don't hear anything from you, I'm going to assume, again, that you're okay. So just make sure that you're being proactive. All right, so I do want to make sure, hold on one second, guys, that this is still recording. Yes, it is. Good. Because I had a nightmare. My last class, it wasn't recording my actual lecture. And I said, oh my goodness gracious. All right, so let's go ahead and get started talking about feature writing. For those who have taken like other journalism classes and what have you, this will probably a little bit repetitive or sound familiar. For those who have never taken a journalism class, feature writing is, at least in my opinion, something that I feel like a lot of students like, and they honestly prefer it compared to what we've been talking about so far in class. As you guys know, with traditional news articles, it's organized by the inverted pyramid style, where you kind of get straight to the point in terms of like mentioning what happened, who was in the story, when did it take place. So you have your summary lead first, and then it's organized and descending order of importance. A feature article is very different in nature in terms of how it's organized. It tends to gear more towards human interest stories and tends to be a lot longer than your traditional news pieces. And also, I think another reason why some students prefer feature stories compared to traditional news stories is because, again, it's longer. And then also you get to add more of your creative writing skills to that as well. So let's go ahead and talk more specifically about these characteristics of feature writing. Here's the more formal definition. I kind of broke it down here based upon what I talked about in the textbook. So again, feature writing is not really defined by, the topics, so to say, or so to speak. It's more so defined by the style of writing, what I mentioned earlier. It's longer, it's more in depth, it's more creative writing, more visual writing in terms of, compared to a traditional news article. And so it doesn't have to be about breaking news. And so that's why I put there in my second point, it's probably going to have a little less immediacy, but it still is in some capacity really interesting to a large amount of people. So one thing, and just to mention COVID-19 really quickly, I'm going to try to stay away from that. But to bring it up, one thing that I've kind of criticized in my head in terms of the media coverage is that we're not hearing enough human interest stories about this virus. We're hearing, the death count, the infection count, and what have you. And it's all about data and all of that. And that's important too. But I'm wondering where, again, are those, human interest stories that really connect the reader to what's truly going on, whether it's in the hospitals and in homes and cities across, the nation. So I think that's where the opportunity in writing a feature article comes into play. Again, stories or good stories are something that really motivate people. I would say all people. If you can tell a really good story to folks, you got them. You're really persuasive. So yes, feature stories in terms of from a PR standpoint, they help to, again, humanize our organization, and they also help to highlight someone in our company that is newsworthy or can provide news value to a story. So even though it's not organized in inverted pyramid style, and it's not, this very linear formula where, again, it's the who, what, when, where, why, and how, it still is, and as I put here in my second to last point, it's still news. We're not making up information. This is not fictional information. It is true. So I think one thing that will help you guys out in terms of for your own feature story that you'll write later on, when you're trying to figure out what to write about, I recommend thinking to yourself, what are some stories we don't hear about, a lot in the news? Who do you think has a really interesting story that you feel as though other people could benefit from or can relate to? So that's essentially feature stories. Any questions over that? I want to pause. If you do have questions, go ahead and put it in the chat there. Oh yeah, sorry, my last point there. So feature stories are very popular in magazines. In fact, I believe here at Ohio State, we do have a magazine writing class with Dr. Kraft and a feature writing class as well with the same professor. Okay, so in terms of, again, how a feature story is organized, so we love to use shapes in journalism and public relations. So in just a second, I'm going to discuss what we call the diamond shape organizational pattern. Again, that's how we typically organize the information in a feature piece. So once more, it's not going to follow that inverted pyramid style that we've been working through and incorporating in our press releases and in our traditional news articles. It really is, however, the writer feels like is most beneficial to conveying the story. So there, even though I'm going to talk about the diamond shape pattern in just a second, you have a lot more leeway and autonomy, at least in my opinion, when you're writing a feature story as opposed to a news story or a traditional news story. But again, with that being said, even though you have a lot more autonomy and flexibility, you want to make sure that it has a nice flow. So that's what I mean by that third point. Everything should kind of like come together and support the main purpose of the story. And that is why transitions are extremely important. It's not a situation where, and sometimes I see this from students who are, just learning how to write feature articles. You will definitely use a lot more direct quotes, again, to further humanize that story, but you can't just go from one direct quote to the next without some type of transition, you know, in between those two quotes. So I'm not interested in reading a story that's just quotes, 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 quotes. Make sure that you have transitions so that it kind of threads all the different working parts in your feature piece. But I will say some of the more technical aspects of features still apply as they did in traditional news stories. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that we're using active voice, AP style still applies. Direct quotes still take on their own paragraph for the most part, even though I will say the summary lead, or the lead I should say, in your feature is typically a lot longer than your traditional news lead. But I'll get into that on Thursday's class as well, because again, I want to make sure that I'm pacing the class. Any questions? Make sure I'm checking the chat. Nope, okay. Okay, so this is the diamond shape organization pattern that I was referring to earlier. So again, unlike the inverted pyramid style where we put the most important information first, or in other words, the purpose of the story, what happened first, we're actually going to wait a little bit to do that in our feature piece. And we call that a delayed lead, and it's on purpose, right? So in other words, the way that a feature article is organized is typically how a traditional story in general would be organized. For those of you who like to read when you were little or still like to read, that's typically how we see feature articles organized. So you have like a somewhat of a long introduction, not too long because you don't want to lose your readers. And then maybe in the second or third paragraph, you convey what the story is all about. So again, that's what I mean by that first part in the diamond shape there that you see at the top. So we describe, or I'm sorry, we begin the feature story with some type of like detailed description or some type of minor narrative that's related to the larger story that, you know, we're talking about in this feature. Then we get to the point in terms of like what the story is about, and we include a lot more factual information. That's going to be, you know, again, the second or third paragraph, and then throughout the body of our article, excuse me. And then at the very end, we hook it back to that, you know, the beginning, whether it's, you know, ending with a quote of some fashion or another minor narrative, something that isn't, you know, so factual, but it leaves a lasting impression on the reader. So that's typically how a feature article is organized. And so here on this slide, I'm just describing some of the differences that we typically see between traditional news stories and then feature writing. Again, with traditional news stories, we refer to them as, using the term, I should say, hard news. So again, it's typically, you know, to the point, very linear type of, you know, writing. And then with feature writing, again, I don't really like the term soft news, to be honest with you, or hard news, because I feel like people take traditional news stories more seriously when we use that type of language. But nevertheless, you'll probably hear that term being used when we're referring to feature writing. And again, I think it's because there's such an emotional appeal in feature writing. That might be one of the reasons why we're using the term soft news. And then again, just to kind of be a little repetitive with traditional news stories, we're using a lot of facts, not to say that we're not in feature stories, but with feature stories, we're using a lot more direct quotes. And also in feature stories, we want to make sure that we're showing the reader what's going on. That is something that maybe some of you guys will have to get used to, because in traditional news stories, including press releases, we're just telling the reader what took place or what's going to take place. Whereas with feature stories, you have to really, for example, describe the scene, describe whoever, you know, you're featuring in that story, how they look. So it's really, you know, your job as the writer to tap into those five senses, as you see there in the right-hand column under feature writing, and make sure that you really immerse your reader into that storyline. I'm not saying you're not going to do that in a traditional news story, but that's even more imperative in a feature piece. And once more, just in terms of some of the, you know, obvious details here, obvious differences with traditional news stories, they tend to be, you know, to the point, very short. And then with feature stories, they're a lot more in depth. They can be anywhere from 500 words to 2,000 words. You see a lot of these feature pieces, for example, in the National Geographic and Time. So again, in a lot of news news magazines. All right, so what I'd like to do is show you guys an example of a feature. Let's see here. This feature is a little dated. I'm going to put it in the chat if I can. This feature is about former Ohio State football coach Urban Meyer. I'm not sure if you guys can see that in the chat there. Go ahead and open that article, and I just want you to read maybe the first few paragraphs. And in about 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to ask you guys, what are some of the differences that you notice in reading this type of article compared to some of your more traditional articles? And let me know if you can't access that. Yeah, I'll give you guys maybe 2 more minutes or so. Mhm. All right, go ahead and submit some of your observations in terms of the differences that you notice in this feature piece compared to what you might find in any given traditional news story. So Chase wrote here, right off the bat, the format of the story catches my eye, has a greater aesthetic appeal than a regular news story. And then Sam wrote, the article tells more of a story, almost feeling like the start of a book. Absolutely. It has greater detail and sets the scene using imagery and other details. Again, you really feel like you're sitting there with Urban Meyer, you know, in his house and having this conversation with him. Absolutely. Uses a dialogue to make the reader more connected to the article and the people being featured. Very good. Anyone else have some observations? I'll give you another minute to jot that down. Yep. So Alexis wrote a full dialogue between Urban and his wife, allowing the reader to connect with the couple. Yep. So again, it's a situation where the writer is doing a really good job of, going behind the scenes in terms of the life of Urban Meyer, beyond, this major reformer, now that he's not the coach anymore. But, beyond being a major NCAA, football coach or Big Ten coach. And then Jenna wrote, the first two paragraphs make you wonder what the story will be about. Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I first read this article, I thought, okay, so what's the point? And I think the way that the writer wrote this, it actually is very beneficial to the story, because since I was thinking, what is this story about? I was more motivated to figure that out, if that makes any sense, because that lead, or conveying the purpose of the story, was delayed. And then she also continues to write, I want you to keep reading. Yes, absolutely. You have to stick with the story to find out exactly what it will be about. Yep, excellent. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. It seems like you guys are getting some of the differences between a feature and then a traditional news story. On Canvas, there are two other examples of feature stories. They're not as descriptive in detail compared to what you might find in the Urban Meyer example that I gave you guys, but they're still considered feature articles, again, because they're taking more of that human interest angle, more in-depth stories, and highlighting someone's unique lived experience. So why do we use feature stories in public relations? One big reason why we use that is from a media coverage standpoint. And again, it's a really cool way to share a story that maybe you don't hear about all the time, that's relevant to your client or relevant to your company. So maybe not just talking about a new product that you're launching, but maybe the story behind that product. Maybe there's a really touchy-feely story behind that, and we might want to write a feature concerning that. Or maybe we have a new CEO, that's coming to our company, and they have a really cool, background and what have you. So those would be some of the reasons why we might want to write a feature in PR. And again, it's a different take on a news story than what you might find in a press release. And then also we might use features from an internal standpoint. This helps out a lot in terms of the morale of the company. So you might be featured in the internal, communications, like the internal newsletter, for instance. And, your colleagues are talking about you, your boss is talking about you. So we use it both for internal and external purposes as well. And it is something that, to be honest with you, I don't think is ever going to go away in public relations. I know there's some discussion as to the utility of press releases, but I really feel like feature articles are here to stay because it provides so much of that human interest angle that really connects all of us as human beings. Okay, so again, just some quick tips for you guys. Again, this is going to make a lot more sense and be a lot more applicable as you guys practice feature writing. So I talked about how in feature stories, there are a lot more direct quotes, but we don't want to overdo it because you still have to demonstrate that you have, efficient writing skills, that you know how to paraphrase information, that you're being strategic, right, in the types of quotes that you're choosing. It's not just a matter of whether or not you have 10 direct quotes in your feature story. You want to make sure that you're being a little picky in terms of the types of direct quotes that you're choosing, not just, whatever, that person said. Is it really going to be compelling and motivate the reader to, engage in your storyline here? And then also the type of features that I want you guys to write in class are called profiles. And again, they're typically about, a person's lived experience, or it can be about a profile about a business, for example, like behind the scenes of a business. And so with that being said, I am going to push you guys to be a lot more descriptive and visual in detail or in nature. This is something that might be a little difficult for some of you guys, but that's okay. We're going to do a lot, of exercises in your tight deadline assignment, and as well as an optional assignment that you guys will hear more about later on Thursday. So again, the job here is to really make sure that you're describing what's going on, making sure that you're using, those 5 senses. I should literally be able to see what's going on in this feature article. I should be able to imagine it. I should be able to hear it, right? So using all of those senses to convey the story. And then after we have our lead, then we're going to get into the body, the plot, right? So these are just some of the different ways that you can organize or that you can, talk about the plot or the main idea of your story. It can be about, some type of conflict that's happening in that person's life, especially if you're talking about a business. So how is this business going to stay afloat in light of, for example, COVID-19? It could be, something that we see a lot in sports features right? So how does a really, well-known athlete recover after a major injury? So that's, a really popular plot that we see in features. It could be, again, just a unique concept that you don't hear about a lot. Or a unique story, right? So it doesn't have to be a conflict. It can be just unique or novel in nature. And then also, if that doesn't work for you, you might want to organize that information in chronological order. I kind of hesitate to say that, however, because I feel as though when it's organized in chronological order, you kind of miss the opportunity to really engage in with your reader in a more meaningful way. But I'm not saying it won't work. So this is an example of, what I mean by showing the reader what's going on as opposed to telling. That first passage that you see here is what we probably will find in a traditional news piece. So it reads, friends describe Amaria as a generous and vibrant person who is involved in several nonprofit organizations. So it's to the point, right? There's nothing wrong with it in terms of grammar or punctuation or the purpose of that statement, but I can't imagine, what's going on here. The second passage is what I'm really looking for from some of you, or from all of you guys for that matter, but you don't have to do this throughout the feature article. So it reads, Tracy profoundly recalls her friend's generosity. Amaria is usually the first person to arrive at a volunteer event. And my apologies, I'm noticing here that I can't see the rest because of the chat. Okay, great. And the last to leave. She spends 4 hours every Saturday morning to volunteer at the mentoring center. It's rare to not catch her laughing, flashing her perfect smile and dark green eyes. She's just a burst of positive energy. So once more, I can really imagine how Amaria looks. I can imagine her dynamic personality, her caring personality, right? So that's what we want to kind of hone in on, on occasion in our feature article, as opposed to just telling the reader what's going on or telling the reader about this particular person. I'm going to pause here. Any questions? And check the chat just to make sure. And then lastly, your feature conclusion. You want to make sure that you're leaving some type of lasting impression. Now, again, you can use a quote. There are some professors who don't like to end a feature article with a quote. I think it's fine. You can, again, connect your conclusion back to however you started your article. I think that's a really cool way to kind of embody that full circle moment, if you will. Just something that, again, that's creative and leaves a lasting impression on the reader. You're not going to do what some of you guys have been taught in high school or even junior high, the 5-paragraph essay formula, where you kind of summarize, whatever was stated in the beginning in a very formulaic, manner. You definitely want to try not to do that, because again, that's not really, engaging. So. All right, actually, I'm going to go ahead and stop there because, again, I'm going to talk about writing feature leads during our next class. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here. Okay, so that's actually all I have for you guys. Are there any questions whatsoever for today's class? Hopefully that went okay. I did record this, so if you need to refer back to today's lecture, what I'm going to do is just upload this video onto YouTube and then include that link in the Canvas, so under this week's module. Make sure there aren't any questions.
I have a question. So as I'm thinking about this feature article, I'm wondering what can we write about, because everything's been canceled and I'm just not really sure what would be, I guess, good to write about.
Yeah. That's a really great question, Abby. So you don't have to write about, for example, an event, right? So you had to do that, or you could have done that for your press release assignment, or we talked about doing that a lot in light of our press release assignment. But again, it's about, human stories, right? So what is it like to be a student athlete, for instance, at a Big Ten university? What is it like, just to add an additional layer to that, what is it like to be a student athlete at a Big Ten university who also has, cancer? Not to sound, super serious or anything like that. But again, these are stories that we don't hear all the time. I do have examples in the feature article assignment, and I can actually pull that up for you guys right now since we have a little bit of time. Examples of, stories that students have wrote about in the past. Just bear with me. I'm going to share my screen in just a second. And then Jenna, I'll get to your question in just a second as well. All right, so again, this is in the assignment description, the feature article assignment description. You can either access it using the tool here, assignments, or go to modules, and I think it's in week 13 modules. So I haven't described your feature article assignment again because it's not due until later on, but if you take a peek here at the folder, you'll see several examples, student examples, in fact, from students or student examples in the past. So I had one student who wrote about what it's like to be a Republican on a very, left-leaning campus like Ohio State. I had one student who, this article was published in the Lantern, in fact. My student, I think her name is Claire, who wrote about this female engineering student, I believe she was, who won the Ohio, hackathon that I think took place last year or the year before. And then the second article that you see here is a feature about a business, right? So it doesn't have to be, Abby, about like a specific event that's coming up or, some type of promotion that you might see in a press release. Again, it's about human stories, stories that you don't hear about a lot, something that you feel like readers would want to know more about, but it's not necessarily hard news like a crime that took place or a major announcement at Ohio State. Not sure if that answers your question or not. Does it, Abby, or are you still kind of like,
Yeah, I think that answers my question. I'm just gonna like contemplate on what to write about.
Yeah. So Abby, I know you're really into obviously farming and agriculture, right? So
Yeah.
what are some stories that you feel like, like some human interest stories that you feel like people don't know a lot about as it relates to the agricultural industry? It could be not just what it's like to be a farmer, but what is it like to be a farmer in an economy that, might be tanking, soon? That's something that we're not hearing about a lot. At least I'm not hearing about a lot, right? So I would, that could be an example of a feature story as well. So there's a lot of different avenues that you can take, this feature idea from, or, take it through. But I definitely don't want you to feel like it has to be like some, event or, some breaking news or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I want to get to another question. Sorry, guys, this is so confusing on my end. Let's do stop share. Okay, there we go. You still want it to be about someone we do not personally know? Great question, Jenna. So yes, you do need to have some distance from the main person that you want to profile or write about in your feature piece, because again, conflict of interest, all of those journalistic ethics still apply in a feature story. Now, if you have like a friend of a friend who has a really interesting story, or your parents work for someone who has a really interesting story, that's fine. But it can't be like, a feature about your parents or about your boyfriend or girlfriend, or maybe a professor that you currently have. Now, if you've had this professor in the past, like let's say that they're conducting some really interesting research, we're not hearing about it, that would be a great example of a feature as well. Even though, you've had this professor before, we argue in journalism that there's still, some distance because you're not interacting with that person on a regular basis. So that would be fine, Jenna. But yeah, not about someone that you know personally or intimately. We want to make sure that we're not engaging in any conflict of interest or anything. And then Alexis, does the feature story have to revolve around something involving OSU? No, absolutely not. It does not have to have anything to do with Ohio State, anything to do with Columbus, right? Again, some other examples that I've seen from students in the past. This student wrote about another student who was in the Victoria's Secret fashion show, I think 2 years ago, but she's also a college student. So what was it like, to be in such a major fashion show, but also be, a college student? And this student, I think she was a student at Columbia University in New York, I want to say. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it had nothing to do with Columbus, but it was still really interesting to read about this person's experience. Any other questions that you guys might have? And again, you can access this information if you go to assignments and then click on where it says feature article, or go to next week's module. I have that assignment embedded, excuse me, in there as well. All right, well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and end class today. Thanks so much. Oh, wait, hold on one second. Okay, thanks so much for sticking with me. Hopefully this went pretty, good for you guys, and I'll see some of you guys on Thursday. Take care.